Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
Hello to anyone who's listening to this asynchronously. It's nice to be back in the Rashi rhythm. The last thing we did was chapter 8, verse 24, including verse 24. There was no Rashi on that. I also had a note to myself that I wanted to go back one verse and look at a chizkuni with you on verse 23. So we're going to linger for a few minutes on 23 and 24 of chapter 8, even though we finished it, before we move on to verse 25. Okay? So chapter 8, verse 23, let me just remind us what's going on here. This is the negotiation between Paro and Moshe on the plague of Arov, which is the single plague about which we have the least amount of clarity as to what it actually is. Rashi reads it through the whole way that it's wild beasts. There's a negotiation about what it's going to take for God to remove it, and Moshe says we want to go out a couple of days and give a sacrifice to our God, and how can we possibly do that in town? Because if we do it in town, it's going to be considered some kind of an abomination to the Egyptians for us to do it. Or the other interpretation, we might be sacrificing that which is holy to the Egyptians, and how would they not stone us? That's verse 22. Verse 23, this is a continuation of what Moshe is saying back to Pharaoh. Derech shloshet yamim nelech bamidbar. We're going to go a 3 days journey into the wilderness. V'zavachnu l'Adonai Eloheinu. We will sacrifice to Adonai our God, kasher yomar Eloheinu, as God asked us to do. And on that verse, I'll put this on the screen. And again, we already did this verse, but I wanted to go back. Chizkuni says something interesting. Let me find it on my screen. Okay. I'm out of practice here, just with all the things I need to click. Oh, good. Thanks, Hector. Yeah. Okay, so if you look at the screen...
There's waiting room.
Oh, there's waiting room? All right. Okay. Yes, welcome to those who just joined on Zoom, to Bobby and to Renee. So, look what Chizkuni says. I guess someone else can you somehow move the bar on the screen to the bottom?
Go to the very top and click on the one that looks like a tic-tac-toe board.
Okay.
That works even better.
Okay. So this is Chizkuni on verse 23 on Moshe saying to Pharaoh, what we want to do is go and sacrifice for 3 days. And the reason why I think Chizkuni is motivated to say what he's about to say is that we know that the ultimate goal is not for them to go out for 3 days and sacrifice to God, but to flee, right? And we don't want to imagine Moshe as a prevaricator, right? We want Moshe, even in his negotiation with Pharaoh, to be able to say things that are plausibly true. That's my understanding of the motivation for Chizkuni here. Look what he says. Shekain, because after all, Bayom Hasheni, on the second day of what? Of the eventual Exodus, Chanu b'tchilat hamidbar. They encamped at the beginning, the edge of the desert, Kedichtiv, as it says, Vayisu misukot vayachanu be'etam, that they journeyed from Sukkot and they encamped be'etam, biktsei hamidbar, at the edge of the desert, perush b'tchilat hamidbar, which means in the beginning of the desert. And if you look at that verse in context, here, right? So this is actually several chapters later, chapter 13 of Shemot. If you have it in your own book, if you want to look, chapter 13, verse 19 and 20. This is the actual telling of Exodus. Actually, if we go back to verse 18, Vayasev Elohim et ha'am, it's still being shared, yeah? That God brought the nation round about, Derech HaMidbar, towards the desert, the wilderness of Yam Suf, V'chamushim alu b'nei Yisrael b'nei Eretz Mitzrayim, they left armed, Vayikach Moshe et atzmot Yosef imo. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. Why? Ki hishbia b'nei Yisrael lemor. He had Joseph had forced the children of Israel to swear, Pakod yivkod Elohim etchem. God will eventually remember you, v'halitem et atzmotai mizeh etchem, and you're going to bring my bones with you. And then we have the information, Vayisum Sukkot. They set out from Sukkot. Vaychanu ve'etam. They encamped at Etam b'ktzeh hamidbar. Look what Chizkuni says there on the right side of the screen up there. Vayisum Sukkot. They journeyed from Sukkot on the second day, and they camped at the edge of the desert. And the implication that Chizkuni is saying in our verse is, and what did they do when they got up on the third day? Made a sacrifice, exactly as he said they were going to do, right? So yes, of course, after that, they intended not to go back to Egypt, but to keep going. But I believe Chizkuni is saying in our verse, lest you think that Moshe was saying an outright lie to Moshe, to Pharaoh, when Moshe said, Derech shloshi yamim nelech b'midbar, for 3 days we're going to go in the wilderness, v'zavachnu l'Adonai Eloheinu, and we're going to sacrifice Adonai our God. That's exactly what they planned to do. Okay, he didn't mention that on the day after the sacrifice, they're going to keep going in the same direction, going back into the land of Canaan. And this is, kind of a classic, both Talmudic and medieval style to do anything possible to make the most implausible or hard to defend words uttered by our ancestors work in some moral realm. Yeah. Microphone, Elon.
So I'm curious as to why the aversion in this spot to telling a lie to achieve a goal, when you certainly have, Jacob and Esau and other examples where, Jacob and Laban, where there were lies told. And why here is it so objectionable? But, whereas you would say, okay, he told a lie for a good reason. There's nothing, the other places, maybe, particularly with Jacob and Esau, he told a lie for maybe not a good reason, right?
Yeah.
So why is it so objectionable here that they would go out of their way to try to justify it?
My instinct, Elon, is not that it's so objectionable that he would have told a lie. It's that layered and threaded through our tradition and speaking to us in real moments like today is that even when facing a tyrant, we hold ourselves to high standards, right? That even when Moshe is speaking to Pharaoh, Moshe don't become a Pharaoh, right? When Moshe when Moshe is defeating an enemy, somehow, even in the words we use, and this is a fantasy, right? But we want to imagine Moshe, our first leader, as holding himself to a layer of truth, even in those moments. And yes, even though Yaakov was a deceiver, that's what I spoke about on Shabbat, right? Yaakov was a deceiver, and Yaakov was someone who was embarrassed by his son's militance, right? And it's both, right? We're both the Moshe who would do anything to get the Jews out of Egypt, and we're the Moshe in Chizkuni's fantasy who says, I probably shouldn't tell a lie because my words should have truth to them. It's my guess, right? Barry and then Larry. Microphone, Barry.
Well, just there's a slight out in the text is the sacrifice to Adonai our God, kasher yomar aleinu, in the manner that God will tell us. It's a kind of an out there. So yeah, we don't know what's going to happen next, but God will tell us.
Yeah. Yes. Larry?
I have kind of a different perspective here. It's motivated by the alternative translation in the JPS, but also in Aryeh Kaplan, where he says, what we must do is make a 3-day journey. It doesn't say we're going to go. He says we have to, and so does JPS. So if you look back at the beginning of this negotiation, that's what it is. It's a negotiation.
Yeah, I'm listening. I just poured coffee on myself.
Ooh, and I don't want to make too much of it, but we can think of negotiations taking place even today between adversaries and the lack of transparency and the lack of honesty. But if you want to grant Moses sincerity in his arguments, the argument's clear, and the argument is, we don't want to offend you with our sacrifices, so what we must do is get far enough away from you that there's no chance that any Egyptian would be offended, and that is 3 days' journey.
Yeah, I actually think that works too, and I guess if I could animate my suspicion of what Chizkuni would say is that Pharaoh might be hearing, all we want to do, Pharaoh, is to go 3 days out, make the sacrifice, and come back. And since we know that that's not all they want to do, we have to somehow make it okay, make it true that what Moshe said they were going to do, they actually ended up doing. It may be the truth, but not the whole truth. The truth, but not the whole truth, right? I think that in the context of the story, your interpretation makes sense as well, right? That we really don't want to do this in your presence. Parentheses, what I'm not telling you is that what we want to get out, make the sacrifice, and then keep going. But we want to get at least 3 days away so that we're not going to further insult you and further endanger us by rousing up the locals. Norm? You need a microphone, Norm.
I want to address the issue of calling this a negotiation between Pharaoh and Moshe, because in this case, I don't think Moshe is acting as an independent leader. He hasn't been acknowledged by anyone other than perhaps Pharaoh to be the leader of the Jewish people yet. Really what we have, or of the Israelites, really what we have is Moshe being more like an emissary of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the negotiation is between Pharaoh and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, except, of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu isn't talking directly with Pharaoh. He has to deal with Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe isn't going to be able to say, yes, this is acceptable, no, this isn't acceptable. All he can do is say, I'll go check with God and see what he has to say.
My response to that is maybe, right? It depends on what you imagine happens in between the verses of the Torah, which is where all of Midrash begins, because we don't have Moshe going back to God, at least explicit in the text, in between every sentence articulated by Pharaoh, right? So maybe that's the case, or maybe we're seeing the emergence of a leader who is both dispatched by God, but then has a certain amount of agency. You know?
When Secretary Blinken meets with the leader of one foreign country or another, or whoever else he meets with, he obviously does not check back with the president between every sentence.
Right.
But he's there as a representative of the United States and of the president.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have carte blanche.
Yeah.
And so he periodically, I'm sure, does check back or confirm, or at least claim to be doing so.
Yes.
So it goes.
Good. That's what I wanted to share with you on 23. We also had read verse 24 last time, and I wanted to share an Ibn Ezra on that before we actually got to new material. Okay? So verse 24, which again we did read, Vayomer Paro, Pharaoh said in response to this, whether we read it Chizkuni's way or Larry Herman's way, he said, Anochi ashalachem, okay, I'm going to relent. I will send you. Uzvachtem ladonai alechem, and I will dispatch you on the terms that you described to me. You will slaughter to Adonai your God, Bamidbar, in the wilderness. Rak harchek lo tarchiku lalechet, but do not overly distance yourself, right? Which is, it's unclear in the Pshat. Is Pharaoh saying, I accept that you're going to go out 3 days, but don't go out farther than that? Or is he saying, you can go, but don't go out 3 days? Unclear. Just says, don't very much distance yourself. Ha'atiru ba'adi, plead on my behalf. We've seen that root before. We saw it a few weeks ago in Parshat Toldot. This is when Yitzchak prays on behalf of Rivka that she become pregnant by Yetar Alanai, and then Lenochach Ishto on behalf of his wife. Okay, plead on my behalf. Onkelos translates this as tsalu, tzadi lamed yud in Aramaic is pray. You know that from the full Kaddish. Titkabel tzlot hon uva'oton, that hard to pronounce Aramaic word. May it be received, titkabel tzlot hon, our tsalim, our prayers. That's the Aramaic word for prayer. So basically Onkelos is not translating it any differently than had it been the word lead paleo. Okay. When we read that verse, Rashi is quiet on that verse. I don't actually remember, because it's several weeks ago, anything that we raised on this verse. So let's pretend that we're doing it for the first time. As you read that verse, what jumps to mind as a worthy question? Maybe you'll anticipate Ibn Ezra's question. Norm? Microphone? Microphone.
Oh.
It might be
the
better
end,
to
when
take it
Pharaoh
off the
says-
stands.
What?
Take the microphone off the stands. It's easier to pass.
At the end, when Pharaoh says, pray for me, the question is, go and pray that this shall be acceptable, that you're not going to go very far away and that you're going to come back. Or does it mean he wants in general a blessing from the Holy One?
Right. The question is, what the hell does Hatiru Badi mean here, right? Forget about the theology of it. Because the theology of it is suggesting that Pharaoh is believing that their God is worth praying to. That's interesting in and of itself. But even just on a plot level, what is Pharaoh asking Moshe to pray for, right? And why does it appear where it appears in the verse, right? So that's exactly what Ibn Ezra gets at. So I'll share this one as well. Okay, so this is Ibn Ezra. It's on the screen on 824. Milat ha'atiru, the word, quote, ha'atiru, which is the word for entreat, ha'atiru badi, entreat on my behalf, haita re'uya lahakdim, should have come first. In other words, Ibn Ezra is saying, the verse should have said, Vayomer Paro, Pharaoh said, ha'atiru badi, pray on my behalf, ... anochi eshalachachem, and then I will let you go. Right? Ibn Ezra says more. Ki hatam ha'atiru badi. The reason why I want you to pray on my behalf, v'tasur zo hamaka, is so that you pray to remove these darn arovs, whether they're insects or wild beasts. V'az ashalachem, and then I will send you lizboach b'midbar, to sacrifice in the desert. Kasher amartem, as you said. Rak al t'nai, I'm only going to let you go al t'nai, on the condition shelo tarchiku lalechet, that you do not go farther than whatever, yoter mihashlosha yamim, more than 3 days. So Ibn Ezra's reading that Pharaoh's saying don't go very far is basically agreeing to Moshe's 3-day, not fighting with it, right? In other words, Ibn Ezra says to say pray for me at the end seems odd. It's as if it's as if our God is Pharaoh's God, and Pharaoh saying to Moshe, oh, by the way, when you have an audience with God, pray for me. Right? It can't be that. It's got to be, go pray on my behalf that God remove these infernal arov, and if God does, sure, I'll let you go, but only in that condition. It's an interesting reordering of the verse. Larry? Microphone?
Ibn Ezra is great, but I think he misses it here.
Okay.
I think that Alter has something but doesn't complete it here. Alter translates this phrase, this verse as, and Pharaoh said, I myself will send you off. So Pharaoh is physically, personally, himself sending Moses or offering to send Moses and Bnei Israel out into the desert. And then at the end of the phrase, he comes back to himself. So plead for me on my behalf, not the Egyptian people's.
Hold on 1 second. You can close it, but you have to tell someone to turn the heat off in here. It's an oven. Well, you can close it, but then get them to turn the heat off.
Not the Egyptian people's behalf, on his behalf. So the me and the me at the beginning of the end is I forget what you call it in poetry,
Chiasm?
Yeah, something like chiasm, right? And it's in closing what it is that he's asking Moses to do, but it's very personal. It's for Pharaoh himself.
Explain again then why Hatiru Badi deserves to be at the end according to that reading.
Because it starts off Pharaoh saying, this is a personal favor I'm going to be asking. This is something I'm doing personally, because I'm personally sending you off. And I'm surprised that none of the other translations actually catch that. Alter does.
As opposed to what?
Is I'll let you go. It says, Anochi, I, Ashalach. Is it lach? Yeah, Ashalach. He didn't have to say Anochi. That's emphasizing I am me. It's me, Pharaoh, who is going to. Now, Alter translates it as I'm going to send you off, which is a fine translation for Ashalach, but otherwise you could have said Ashalach.
You mean without the pronoun?
Yeah, without the Anochi.
But who else would be? I get that, but I'm saying.
So I'm going to ask you. I'm going to flip it back to you.
Okay.
Why does it have to be Anochi? Why isn't it simply V'yomer Paro Ashalach etchem? I'm sending you off. So, but the emphasis is it's Pharaoh himself, and as I say, Alter says that he's actually physically sending them off. He's going to stand there at the edge of the desert and wave goodbye to them as they go. And he's saying, but take that with you. Take my personal plead with you.
Hands are up. So, in other words, since I'm personally doing this, at the end I'm going to say, and come on, just pray for me then, right? And therefore it works as a coda to the verse.
Yeah, he doesn't say it. I found a word. He doesn't say at the end, remove the plague. He says, plead for me. It's kind of peculiar.
There have never been more hands up in this room simultaneously. It's so funny. All right, and guess whose hand was up first? Rick on the Zoom. So, Rick, you go first.
Thank you, Rabbi. That's very nice. Everything that Larry...
Nice
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Well, you could have done all the hands in the room first, but thank you. So everything Larry just said, I wanted to say. So there you go. The Anochi has the Ger Shaim on it. Yeah, Anochi isn't needed there, but it's all about I. It's all about him. He's narcissistic, all that kind of thing. So it's the ego. And Ba'adi, he doesn't say entreat for my people because they're suffering so well. He says entreat for me. It's the Ba'adi. It's the Siluk. It's all about me. He's thinking, okay, go ahead and pray to your gods, but you better pray for me too, because I'm of the gods. I'm a god. And it's not about the people. It's all about him. So
thanks, Rick. Let's go around, and then class will be over. Diane.
So I don't understand why suddenly he should want God to remove this plague. God has removed the other ones without Pharaoh asking for it, and presumably at Moshe's word, God's going to do that anyway. So why suddenly is prayer needed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. I think Ibn Ezra sort of asking the same question. His answer is circular. Prayer is needed because Pharaoh wants to be sure that these plagues are going to be removed before he sets them free. But it's a situation where I think your question is better than his answer. Rebecca?
I think that perhaps having the entreat for me at the end shows Pharaoh's perception that the prayer to God is somehow tied to this sacrifice, and that whole ceremony, the sacrificing has to come first, and then Moshe will be able to pray to God.
I think that's exactly right, and I think that's exactly the read that Ibn Ezra doesn't want to accept. But I think you're right to name that if you don't invert it, then you have Pharaoh saying, when you're out there davening, include me in your Amidah, right? And for some reason, Ibn Ezra does not want that image. Ibn Ezra wants the image of, go pray for me so that these things will be removed, and then go do your silly sacrifice out in the desert, right? But I think as it stands, it seems like Pharaoh is saying, maybe your God is worthy of praying, and go, throw in a good word for me too. Yeah, I think that is what the pshat of the text invites us to read, and Ibn Ezra was uncomfortable with it. Why? I don't know.
But I mean that the sacrifice comes first, and it's a precursor then to be able to pray because you've sacrificed.
Correct. Who is next around the table? Rachel?
Rebecca just said what I wanted to say.
Okay. Who's next?
Alan.
Following up on what Rick said about the choice of the word Anochi and Pharaoh being, narcissistic and what's taking place. Anochi instead of Ani. Why Anochi? That's the word for divinity. That what God says when we have the Aseret HaDibrot, it's Anochi. And so the choice of the words may be exactly that Anochi is here to show that Pharaoh views himself as like God, and he's focusing on himself, and therefore he wants to have the blessings for him too.
Meaning it's not just that a pronoun was used when you don't need a pronoun in future tense Hebrew, but that the pronoun that was used was Anochi and not Ani. It's a big pronoun. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
The royal Anochi, yes. Isn't that like a cruise ship, the Royal Anochi? Marshall, did you have your hand up? Barry?
So a bit of a twist here. The phrase "lo takiku," lo laket, don't go too far away, is juxtaposed with the hatiru body. Stay within the sphere that I have my authority, so that your prayer will protect my rulership here. Go beyond that, and I will not be protected. So don't go too far away. Stay within my sphere, and put in the word because to protect my rulership.
Interesting. Good. Rick, is your hand up again or still?
Wait, there. Again, please. Since Ibn Ezra brought up the actual Exodus, I went over there. The last time Pharaoh says anything to Moses, the last word is Gam Oti, bless me. Again, this is chapter 12:32. So he doesn't say, bless my people, they've been suffering so long. The last word he said is Oti. It's all about me. So
yeah, and if everyone look at that, very, very good association, Rick. Everyone look at chapter 12, verse 32. If you all have the book of Exodus, so I don't have to put it up on the screen. In the moment of Exodus,
it's the last thing he says.
Yeah, and in fact, this verse could be used as a proof text against Ibn Ezra's read. Starting in verse 31, Vayikra Moshe u'Laharon, Pharaoh called to Moses and Aaron, Laila, in the middle of the night, Vayomer, said, Kumu tz'u mitoch ami, get the hell out of here. Gam atem, gam b'nei Yisrael, you and your people. Ulechu, go. Ivdu et Adonai kedaberchem, go worship your God as you've been saying. Gam tzomchem, take your sheep. Gam bekarchem, take your cattle. Kechu, kasher dibartem belecho, as you said in Gan, uverachtem gam oti. There's no way that Ibn Ezra could say there that go pray to remove, you can't remove a 10th plague. It's one thing that can't be undone, right? Here, at the end, you have a Pharaoh saying, I yield, I submit, and while you're in relationship with your higher power, put in a good word for me. For some reason, Ibn Ezra does not want to read that sense in our verse, but very good, Rick. It's undeniable that that's the sense in this verse. Alan?
Yeah, I was just
microphone.
Just briefly at the Rashi about why he says it right here about pray for me, because it's pray for me because I'm a firstborn. And so he wanted to make sure that he didn't die as a result of what was taking place.
Well, that's what Rashi says on that verse?
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
He's the firstborn.
Tov, has your hand up?
I'm thinking, a lot of what I was going to say has been said. But,
Okay. Okay. Larry.
This is a question for you. Can you give a translation that's not here of the phrase rak harchek lo tarchiku? The doubling of the verb there is interesting.
The doubling of a verb in biblical Hebrew is almost always in the positive, not the negative, right? B'haya'im Shemot tishma'u, in old translations, that's where the word verily comes in. If you will verily listen, right? It's an intensifier. So it's harder to do it in English to intensify it negatively, right? Please don't, surely don't you dare, like, whatever you do, don't dare go far. I beg you not to go far. I forbid you from going farther. But it's a bigger version of, it's a bigger finger wagging than lo tarchiku. It's harchek lo tarchiku. In Hebrew slang used in Arabic, you would say dir balak, like no, like don't you dare, something like that. Leonard, and then Tova.
You could say, don't go far, far away.
You could, in a galaxy far, far away. Tova.
First, could you explain a little bit about chatiru? What precisely is? I have the translation entreat, but what is that?
So
to ask for benefits on my behalf? Or?
We know it from context, right? So I'll put on the screen the first time the root appears in the Torah. It's Parshat, we had it a few weeks ago, Parshat Toldot. Second. Let me put this on the screen. Okay, so if you look at the screen, beginning of Parshat Toldot, verse 21, Vaye'atar Yitzchak l'Adonai lenochach ishto. Yitzchak atarred God on behalf of his wife. It's translated here as entreat. It's pray. It's pray that you get a specific response. And it's interesting, later on in the verse, you see atar in the direct pal form, and then the nifal, to be entreated. Ki akarahi, for she was barren. Vaye ater lo Adonai, which is a way of saying God was successfully entreated, meaning the prayer worked. God responded to the entreaty. Is the English word entreaty entreat the exact proper way of rendering atar? I'm not sure. I'll show you what BDB does. By the way, there are several online places where BDB exists, and one of them has just closed down, and I'm very upset by it, because that one was much easier to use than Sfaria. So atar. To pray, to supplicate. Interesting. In the BDB it says always to God. It's never to ask a king of something. It's always to pray to God. From an Arabic word that meant to slaughter for sacrifice. And yes, in the Nifal, to be supplicated, to be entreated, always of God.
Okay. Yeah, I trying to shape the thought I had, but it's I'm wondering if what it could represent is with the kind of arrogance he's showing with the Anochi, the emphasis on I have this power and I'm going to exert it, but I'm setting these limitations on you. If that final thing could be better understood as in our history, we have been forced to call for blessings on Caesar. I'm going to exert my power and allow you to do this, but you are going to bless me or bring something good for me while you're at it.
Interesting. Right, so I think what you're introducing is it's possible to read ha'atiru ba'adi as abject humility. I submit and I need God's help, or the opposite.
The opposite. And that because of the Anochi,
yeah.
That it rings more with that.
Very nice. Right. God to God. Yeah. Joanna. By the way, can I say something before Joanna talks? We're going to meet Joanna in person in January. She's coming to Kol Tfilah, and she's going to become three-dimensional, and we're so excited that you're going to be within the... So every one of you better come to... Hey!
I'm so excited.
Can't wait. Right.
Okay. So I'm noticing, if you think of when your kids want something from you, like when my kids were overly solicitous and did so many great things after dinner, and they cleared the table without asking, and they did the laundry without asking, I knew in my head that there was something.
Sorry, it's like you're speaking gibberish.
Right. So that's why the good stuff proceeds, because I'm going to do all these good things. And now here's my request. Mm. And I'm noticing there's a very similar structure in this. And what's coming up, I just lost the verse. Hold on one second. There's a verse right here somewhere. Why don't I see it now? I just had it, where Moses says that he says, oh, now I lost. Sorry, come back to me. I just lost it.
Okay.
I just lost
While
it.
you're looking for it, I had been meaning to say before we started the class today, anyone around the table read the book The Aleppo Codex, Maddie Friedman's? I'm almost finished with it. It's a fascinating book. It reads like a spy novel, but it's real. Maddie Friedman is a Canadian-Israeli journalist. He's done a lot of really good writing recently about on the situation in Israel. He's also at the core just like a curious journalist, and he wrote a book about one of the more famous versions of the Bible ever written. It was literally like the actual book was the book that Maimonides had as his guide when he was studying Torah, right? It's that old and that venerable. And then it lived in Aleppo for like 600 years. And then what happened to the Syrian Jewish community after the declaration of the State of Israel, right? Instantly, all those Jewish communities became endangered. And there is a whole, like, involves the Mossad, and it involves like early Zionist organizations and disagreements between rabbis and sages about how that book did or did not make its way all out of Aleppo into Israel. It's fascinating. The reason I bring it up is that when it arrived at the Ben Tzvi Institute, Yitzhak Ben Tzvi was the second president of Israel. When it arrived at his institute, because he was a scholar of ancient texts, it was somewhat missing. And there's been an 80-year like search for the missing fragments. And there's one scene in the book where someone in Brooklyn shows, like, in their wallet, in like wrapped in cellophane, a fragment of the Aleppo Codex that somehow made it to the Syrian Jewish community in Aleppo, and the fragment was from this chapter. And I was so interested, and as it's describing the words, I'm like, oh, we're studying that in Rashi right now. It's from, it'd be on your houses and in your storehouses, blah, blah. So this piece of the Aleppo Codex is sitting in someone's wallet in Brooklyn. Okay. Have you found it, Joanna?
No, and I have to leave. I have to go back to teaching. So somehow I lost my thought, and to be continued.
Okay. Teach well, Joanna. Okay. Can we go to verse 24, which is verse 25, which is where we actually were? Yes. Okay, it only took 40 minutes. Okay. Verse 25. So I need a new reader. Joel, do you want to read?
ויאמר משה, הנה אנוכי יוצא מעמך, והתרתי אל אדוני ושר הערוב מפרעה, מעבדיו ומעמו מחר, רק על יוסף פרעה התל לבלתי שלח את העם לזבוח לאדוני.
Even before you translate, everyone can see it's a chunky verse. There are a lot of things to unpack in this verse. To me, Rashi, the one thing Rashi says in the verse is the most pikayun little detail that he's irritated by. I think we're going to spend much more time in this verse than Rashi seemed to. Okay, so let's see if you can translate.
Okay, I have no idea. So Moshe says, he's getting back at the Anochi. Okay, you're going to Anochi, I'm going to Anochi right back at you. I will leave from your people.
Okay, well, not from your people, from your presence. Me imach is the im, right? It's in modern Hebrew would say me itcha, right? Just pause in the translation, and this is obvious. Whom is Moses speaking to? Pharaoh, right? Because me'imach, and yes, it should be me'imcha, but in biblical Hebrew, sometimes a masculine is represented as an imach, even though it's not feminizing Pharaoh. So Moses seems to be in the scene with Pharaoh, speaking directly to him. Go ahead.
And I will entreat, that's the same word.
Yep,
I will entreat to God, and I will dispel. I will get away. I'll get the arov, whatever that is.
What's the subject of the verb vistar? It's
he will.
He. So it's a singular masculine subject with no pronoun, presumably referring to God. So I will entreat God, sort of like the God who will remove the arov.
Or to remove.
Right.
From Pharaoh from his servants and from his people.
Right. What's interesting there?
Which comes first?
What else is interesting?
That he includes the people.
What else is interesting?
That's only the Arov.
Well, that's the plague that's hanging out right now. What else is interesting? It's the same thing that's interesting is as Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Asher Kedushan Mitzvotav V'Tzivanu. What's interesting about the structure of every blessing? That we speak to God in the second person and then refer to God in the third person, right? Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments. Forget about the gendering of it for a second, right? We go from second person to third person in every blessing we say for a mitzvah. If we plotted this scene, Moses is speaking to Pharaoh, and said, I'm going to leave from your presence, and I will entreat God, who will remove the rov from Pharaoh and from Pharaoh's servants and from his people. And if it was just third person, you could imagine, well, maybe that's kind of the language of nobility that you sometimes, like Her Majesty, right? You sometimes refer to a royal in the third person. But it's interesting, it's the second person and third person in the same sentence, right? 1 second, Rick, I see your hand. Keep translating.
Tomorrow, just don't Yosef Paro. Don't become a Yosef.
What does Yosef mean?
It says here be deceitful, but I don't know what that.
Oh, that's the translation of hatel. What does lahosif mean?
To add.
To add. Don't be unnecessarily. Don't add on to your hatel. Whatever the word hatel means, it's translated here as deceitful. We'll spend some time on that, right? And if you look at the Unkelos translates hatel as leshakara. Shaker, to lie. Okay.
I don't know what levilti is.
Levilti is a really interesting Hebrew word. Usually, Hebrew is simpler than English, and sometimes it's more complex. It means without or to not, or it's like bilti nitpas means something you can't possibly comprehend. Like nitpas is something you can catch. Bilti means uncatchable. It's like almost means un.
So if I get rid of
what's that?
Here it's by not letting.
Yeah.
By not or yeah, it's something like by not or don't be a hatel-like person such that you will make the decision not to. Go ahead.
So if I get rid of the arov, don't go back on your word and not send the people to slaughter to their gods.
Say that again.
If I get rid of the arov, then don't go back on your word.
Correct. Exactly right. Right. So al Yosef Paro hatel. Let Pharaoh not be a liar or someone who will deceive deceitfully, in that you will eventually not send the people to go sacrifice the God, which is what you've agreed to do. Okay? Questions, comments on the verse itself? I saw Rick's hand first.
Yeah.
He is. Rick, you should be on Jeopardy. It's like the Ken Jennings of the Rashi class.
Just the trope again. The Kadmavia's law. It's very dramatic. Hine anochi. So again, Joel picked up on it that the anochi of Pharaoh. Moses gives it right back to him. Yeah, and then he's going to go forward. And then I was going to say about the Yosef. I liked. They could have chosen other words besides Yosef, but here he is. Mentioned before Pharaoh. I just thought that was interesting there, but mainly the trope.
Oh, I see. Like that, there could have been other Hebrew words to suggest don't increase your lying that doesn't bring back Yosef. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Yes.
Nice. Okay.
Yes.
Good. Norm?
In the way that Joel translated and you translated, you sort of have Moshe switching to the second person in the latter part of the sentence, but I don't think he does that. He is saying he will pray to the Holy One that he should remove the plague and that God should not let Pharaoh change his mind. And there's an implied threat to Pharaoh. He's not asking Pharaoh to not change his mind. He's saying he's going to ask God to not let Pharaoh change his mind. And the implication there is that if Pharaoh does change his mind, there will be further punishment.
But you're also forgetting that it says me'ima. Me'avadav and not me'avadecha. That's also changing the.
Can't hear that.
Norm, are you suggesting that you could read the pshat as saying that Moshe is saying, I'm going to pray to God that God remove the arov, and that you don't be deceitful with us?
No, and that God not let Pharaoh change his mind. Change Pharaoh's
Yeah.
mind.
Okay, interesting. I mean, this is where a language that doesn't use pronouns every place that Americans use pronoun makes it possible to read it several different ways. See Larry's hand?
Two things. One is altars and one is mine. Altar says, and so he's going to the Hine Enochi Yotze. And says Yotze is not I'm going out, it's I am leaving. I'll just read what altar says. Look, I am going out from your presence. There is temporal urgency in Moses' response as he uses a participial verbal form to indicate that he is already on his way to entreat the Lord. The coy game of asking Pharaoh to stipulate a time of deliverance that marked the previous plague is set aside as Pharaoh's own sense of desperation grows. So he's not asking permission. He's not saying, I will go. He says, I'm going.
Because it's present tense, and you say.
Yeah. My comment or question is, I'm really confused. Because Pharaoh already told Moses that he can go out to sacrifice. He just told him he can't go very far. And here, Moses is saying, but don't act deceitfully again by not letting the people go sacrifice. So either something happened in between the verses that I don't know about, or Moses took Pharaoh's limitation on the distance to be a negation of the permission to actually sacrifice.
Yeah.
And no, does anybody comment on that?
Larry, why don't
Joel.
you say that, okay,
Joel.
you've told us that you're going to let us go. Now if I do my part of the deal and get rid of the Arov, don't go back on your deal. He's not asking for more. He's just asking you to do what you've said you're going to do. Okay.
Larry said, aha. Okay, for those of you who didn't hear that.
One
Rachel.
comment, Ibn Ezra, I think, mentions, and it may be a different comment that I read, that Pharaoh did change his mind after the frogs, and that Moshe wants to kind of insist or enlist God's help in seeing that Pharaoh doesn't do that again.
Yeah, good. I wanted to clarify one thing I said before, or actually add to it before Tova speaks. When Joel was translating, and I stopped him on Basar Ha'arov, and I said, who's the subject of Sar? There is a divergence of opinions just on the raw grammar of the verse. Some people read that the subject of Sar, the remove, is God, right? I'm going to pray to God, and God will remove. Just I'm talking pure grammar, doesn't change the meaning. And some people believe that the subject of Sar is Ha'arov. Yes. That the arov, however you understand that plague to be, will remove itself, because it's unclear if sar is a pa'al or a hefil, or some verbs are causative even if they're not in a causative form. So it doesn't change the meaning of it, but you might come up upon a translation. In fact, that's what your translation says. Yeah, I think Koren translates it that way. Koren says. Moshe said, behold, I go out from thee, and I will entreat the Lord that the swarm of gnats may depart. Right? As if the grammatical subject of the verb sar is the gnats. He says it as gnats, not as wild beasts. So just wanted to clarify that. Tova, let's get Tova a microphone.
This, I feel like this is off subject, but it just suddenly jumped out at me, and I've been trying to figure it out. It just struck me that in this exchange, Moshe is using Yud-He Vav-He to describe God, which he does. I was just glancing back. He does that regularly, though he also uses Eloheinu, Elohim. But it just struck me that Pharaoh answers back using Yud-He Vav-He, and it hadn't hit me because we read it as Adonai, but is I don't know why it's just striking me as that the name we disguise by saying Adonai, and yet here it is being bandied back and forth. Is this just looking back historically? The custom was different.
It's also our version of the story,
It's
right?
our version of the story. And if I look back, maybe it's frequently happened before. I was trying to glance back, and Yud-He Vav-He is used, but I can't find one yet where it's used by Pharaoh.
Right. In our theological idiom, it is interesting to imagine Pharaoh as not saying, go pray to your divinity, but go pray to the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Yeah.
Exactly.
Nice.
Intimacy almost.
Right. Or an acknowledgement.
Yeah.
Diane, and then Norm.
So I was just struck by the fact that Moshe talks about Paro as opposed to addressing him directly as you.
Right. I mean, that's right. That it's both in the verse, right? There's the you in Ani Anochi Yotzeh Me'imach, I'm departing from you,
Right.
and then switches to the third person.
Right. It's in some ways it's deferential, right? Right. And I'm thinking about how with our granddaughter, for a long time, we addressed her by her name and she was addressing, to try and make the switch to you was hard for her.
Yeah.
And the pronoun thing. So, yeah.
We've loved the show The Crown. We're in the last season right now, and when you spend time, in whether a fictionalized or non-fictionalized version of British royalty, your brain does start to think about what it actually means when you're in someone's presence and referring to that person as Her Royal Highness. Like, how did that happen linguistically? Forget about culturally, just linguistically, what it means to say, yes, her teacher's wisdom was so impressive here, but I'm speaking to you. Like, it's a weird thing.
But it's not. I know there's a couple of languages.
Hold on.
Sorry, there's a couple of languages, including Danish, where the way you form the formal you, which is not used very much anymore, but it used to be, is actually you use third person. So, I mean, there was actually two layers. There was a formal you, but I know when my parents were there, if they were speaking of a professor, a teacher at school, they would refer to him as Herr Professor in the third person when they were speaking to
them, right?
Yes. Right. So it's a version of even more distancing version of formal.
Right. And there are a lot of languages that have two versions of the second person, right? Tu and vous. But I don't think that there's any aspect of the French vous, which is third person-y. It's just more formal second person. You're saying that in Danish, there's a version of the formal second person, which is third person-y.
Yes.
Interesting.
And in Portuguese, you use the name.
What Larry said is that in Portuguese, you use the name.
In Portuguese, you actually use the name. And that was really weird for me when I was learning Portuguese, because people would be looking at me and they would say, Senor Larry.
Right.
It was like, I'm here.
Right. Sue?
I think we have it in Hebrew a bit when we say Kvod HaRav.
Good.
In that same way.
Yes. Right. Kvod HaRav literally means the honor of the rabbi. You sometimes will say that to a rabbi, right? And
Would you like us to do that?
Please. And I want you to stand. I want you to stand. But it's true. It's so interesting. When so I'm in touch with the rabbi in Zagreb and the rabbi in Belgrade, where we're spending Shabbat on the Balkans trip, and I don't know them, and I want to show from the very beginning that I am approaching them with a sense of deference, not obsequious, but so I indeed began my emails to them once I got the address, Kvod HaRav. My name is Adam Kligfeld, rabbi in Los Angeles. So I'm referring to him in a third person. Very interesting. Norm?
I think Pharaoh's use of the name is much less significant than we might. if we were discussing something with someone who wants to go worship Baal, even though we all know that Baal doesn't exist and has no power, we still would refer to him as Baal. And we would refer to Ashteret as Ashteret, or Ashtaris, more precisely. So the fact that they're referring to the name of our God by his name, after all, we read in the Torah, Adonai Shmo, I don't think means that he's acknowledging that this is the God. When he asks to be prayed to on his behalf, maybe there he is. But the fact that they're using the name, I just don't think has a huge amount of significance.
Alan, and then I want to at least anticipate what Rashi's going to say, even if we don't actually get there.
Just a grammatical question regarding kavod harav. I've always heard the expression as kibud harav, as respect for the rabbi. You give kibud harav in deference. That's the noun form, and kavod is the verb form.
Well,
what's the difference between kavod harav and kibud harav?
Kibud is the gerund of the verb lichabed, which means to honor. So kibud harav could be referred to as the act of giving honor to the act, the gerund, the gerund of the verb to give honor. Kvod harav is the smichut of a noun, which is kavod, which means honor. And so it's the honor of the rabbi rather than the verb form of honoring the rabbi. So yes, if you wanted to say that you're doing something because you're respecting the rabbi, you're doing it out of kibud harav. But if you are referring to a rabbi, sometimes in the rabbi's presence with honor, you might use the phrase kvod harav, because that's the honor due to that person. So the difference between a noun and a noun formed from a verb, which in English is sometimes the exact same word. I'm going to share the screen. I just want to show you what the verb lahatel means, and then we'll wait for next week for Rashi. Okay, so this is BDB on hatel, right? So if you look on the screen, it says VB dot only, right? What that means is that it's almost it appears in this form only as a verb and never as a noun. Okay. Although in this plural it appears in a noun, and it's PL, that's the P I mean, means to deceive or to mock. Mock is interesting, right? Deceive makes more sense in our verse, right? When Moses is saying, don't you dare continue to deceive us and then go back on your word. It would be interesting to imagine if we should be understanding the tone here to be mock. Don't make fun of us. Don't mock us by promising us you're going to do this and taking it back. And I'm not sure which one I want it to be, but it's interesting because deceive and mock are not the same thing, right? In English, we'd say those are entirely two different words, right? They're both things that you would want, that a scoundrel would do and not a person of integrity, but they're different ways of being a scoundrel. So it's interesting that in biblical Hebrew it means both, and we don't know for certain what it means here. Rashi's only comment on this verse will just be not the meaning of the verb hatel, but the form in which it's in and why it's not in a different form. But for that amazing cliffhanger, you're going to have to wait a week. Leonard.
I'm still thinking about the royal we.
The what? The royal we?
The royal we. For those of us who watch Shtisel, there's various places in there where when they're speaking formally, particularly asking somebody for something, well, they'll use the plural you when there's only one person there that they're talking to. So that's number one.
In Hebrew?
In Hebrew, yeah.
I don't remember that, okay.
So that's number one. And number two, I just read that the royal we was introduced into English in the 12th century by William Longchamp.
Good to know. William Longchamp. Have a good week, everybody. Bye, Scott. Bye, Bobby. Bye, Barbara. Bye, Rick. See you soon.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.